right, I think we've got a good enough number here to get started. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining the webinar this afternoon to learn about new updates to the Maine Social Vulnerability Index. My name is Brian Ambrette. I'm the Senior Climate Resilience Coordinator in the Governor's Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future. There are a growing number of planning tools that can help us as practitioners and local leaders understand the nuances of vulnerability and equity in our communities. When we think about climate vulnerability, we often think about the physical hazards like flood risk or high heat exposures. And often the tools that look at these physical risks do not contain information about the communities and their susceptibility to those exposures. The Maine Social Vulnerability Index is one tool that can add a layer of understanding about demographics and socioeconomics that can illuminate more detail about the types of populations that might be affected. The SVI itself contains only demographic and socioeconomic information, so it must always be combined with a source of information about climate risks. The SVI draws on US Census data, as you will hear, and will need to be updated from time to time as new information becomes available. My office, GoPIF, partnered with our speakers today, Jeremy Bell and Eileen Johnson, and their team to update the SVI in line with current US CDC methods. And this presentation is a first look at that update. This SVI version is still in draft form, and we welcome your feedback and comments as we continue to refine the tool. I'm going to turn the floor over to Jeremy and Eileen in a moment. This webinar is being recorded, and the slides will be made available upon request, so you can email myself or Eileen for the slides afterwards. There'll be time for Q&A following the webinar, so please hold your questions, and we'll use the chat and verbal questions at the end. Thank you so much, and over to Eileen and Jeremy.
Great, thanks, Brian. Eileen, you want to start the presentation?
Or just let me know if we're seeing what you should be seeing.
Yeah.
First
great.
slide. Yep. Okay, great.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. My name is Jeremy Bell. I'm Climate Adaptation Director for the Nature Conservancy's office in Maine. Nice to see so many familiar names and faces on the call today. I'm going to kick things off to give sort of the intro context setting, and then we'll turn it over to Eileen to get more into the vulnerability index and the changes and all that. And so our team is Eileen Johnson from Bowdoin College and Liz Hertz, who many of you know from long distinguished career in state government, and also now the operator of Blue Sky Planning Solutions Consulting. Okay, so next slide, please, Eileen.
Okay. Oops, let me just get my mouse in the right place. Okay.
Great, and so just to give you an overview of the presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about what is social vulnerability. We're going to talk about the difference between the data set that we created off of the 2016 CDC methodology and census data from that time versus the 2020. We'll talk about some of the limitations of using the tool. We'll talk a lot about how it's a planning tool and only a starting point. Eileen will go into more detail on that. Applications for it, and then of course we'd love to have a conversation at the end, so we encourage your questions and comments on that as well. So that's sort of an overview of the arc of the presentation. And initially we created the Maine Social Vulnerability Index for just the coastal towns, because we created it as part of this tool, the Coastal Risk Explorer, that probably many of you have heard of. That's on a TNC web platform, the Nature Conservancy's web platform. And that tool is all about sea level rise. In these images that you see on the maps, it was starting on the left with those little blips of red. Those are roads that are inundated at high tide during certain sea level rise scenarios. And the yellow roads are roads that are inaccessible to emergency services at high tide events. And so all those yellow dots are address points where, for example, the fire truck or the ambulance can't get to your house because the road is inundated. And in addition, showing this slide on the right, that's those shaded colors are what many of you I'm sure are familiar with is the various levels of vulnerability of those communities. We're looking here at Phippsburg and Georgetown, going from less vulnerable in the lighter color to more vulnerable in that sort of more intense orange there. And so we started with that, but then Eileen, as part of the Climate Council, as many of you know, created a statewide layer using more or less the same methodology, but doing it more to, aligned with the municipal level, which I think helps for planning. And then now we're working on the update, so we'll talk about that again more later. And so what is social vulnerability? Well, you know, starting with social resilience, which is the ability to bounce back after an event, such as flooding or other catastrophic events like that. Vulnerability is defined as populations having certain circumstances that affect their ability to bounce back. And so it's sort of somewhat the opposite of resilience. And so the intent of the Maine Social Vulnerability Index is to identify communities and the needs of underserved communities so that we can provide the ability for equitable adaptation, which is that's a goal of mine, at least in my program that we run. And it's important to note, this is referring to that last paragraph in the slide, it's important to note that often the vulnerabilities are the result of societal systems in place that create and cause inequities in the populations. It's not that the populations themselves are vulnerable, if that makes sense. It's sort of like system pressures on communities that create those vulnerabilities. And so that's sort of how we have framed the development of the Social Vulnerability Index and how we've talked about it over the years. And now that there was new census data that came out and we started working on the new tool, that I'm going to turn it over to Eileen, and Eileen can go into the next phases of, well, talking a little bit about the 2016 and then going into the 2020.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. So as Jeremy noted, we developed the Maine Social Vulnerability Index based on the US CDC SVI approach, and the 2016 SVI built on that uses census data, specifically 15 demographic variables, which over on the left, you can see those census variables that were included in the 2016. It uses demographic data from the 5-year American Community Survey, or ACS. We selected the CDC SVI because it is one of the most prevalent indices, and it's also easy to understand and to work with. On the left, you'll see a list of the 16 categories that are grouped by theme: socioeconomic, household composition, minority status and language, housing, and transportation. As this is a national index, it doesn't include factors that are necessarily specific to Maine. We are the oldest state in the nation. Our economy is really tied to natural resource industries. So we've included 3 additional factors, which are highlighted in yellow, to help us get a little bit more at these important characteristics. Population over 65 living alone, employed in the natural resource sector, and percent of population are self-employed. So next, I want to just move towards talking one other thing that we did to customize it. Another way we modified was to align more closely with municipal boundaries, as Jeremy mentioned. The US CDC is based at the tract level, which often encompasses several municipal boundaries, as you can see on the slide here. In developing the 2016 index, one of the things we did is Liz met with a number of representative communities and asked for their input. And what we heard very clearly is the importance of having data at a community level for planning purposes. So the index itself uses a percentage of population and then does a comparison using percentiles. We're following the US CDC method. This is not anything we've developed ourselves, but really sort of aligning with what the recommendations, best practices are. And just when we, with low populations of 0, we excluded those in the 2016. So now I want to turn to what those characteristics or categories look like now in the 2020. So in the 2020, not only do we see a change in population from 2016 to 2020, but importantly, we see some changes to the index itself that was developed by the US CDC. We wanted to obviously use data that was more current, but we also recommended continuing to align the categories with the US CDC. And now that this has 19 categories, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what each of those are, but we did recommend continuing to include the Maine specific categories, that we had before. You can see it's kind of organized in the same way. So the next series of slides, I'll kind of walk you through each of the individual changes since the 2016. The first is there's the US CDC definition of households in poverty has changed from 100% your income that's at 100% of poverty level to 150%. And the reason for that is it aligns with several federal health policy coverages. So this means it represents the percent of individuals whose income falls at 150% of the poverty level or below. A newer category is what's called housing cost burden, which is in place of the percent per capita income, where the prior US CDC looked at average income, with communities having a lower average income weighted more towards being more vulnerable. The housing cost burden represents those individuals with annual income of less than $75,000 that spend 30% or more in housing costs. And the US CDC recommends this use of a factor as it's a better indicator of insufficient disposable income. And I do want to note that all of the descriptions I'm sharing here do come directly from the US CDC SVI documentation that includes cited research for the reasons that they have recommended these changes, if you want to take a look more closely at those. The next change is actually an inclusion of a new factor, population without health insurance. And this actually aligns with a lot of the research Jeremy and Liz and I've been doing over the last few years and listening to communities as this is a factor that came up. And the reason for this category is it provides some measure of socioeconomic status. And as we can imagine, lack of insurance really can be a barrier for healthcare access. I will note that there are slight changes in how language proficiency and minority status have been calculated. I just want to note that I don't think that, and just how they are grouped, just in looking at the two, 2016 to 2020. And then another change has to do with group quarters. We did not include that in the original SVI calculation. Our recommendation is to really include all of the US CDC SVI factors as of the 2020 update. So group quarters are defined as places where people live or stay in a group living arrangement that's owned or managed by an organization that's providing housing or services. So an example would be an assisted living facility. So those are the significant changes. Next, I want to talk a little bit about some other approaches we can use to think about populations, heightened social vulnerability, starting with the, we looked at two factors. One was the equity subcommittee description of priority populations. The report of the equity subcommittee includes a list of priority populations, and the language on the slide is that's taken directly from the equity subcommittee report. And in this report, this list of workers, communities, businesses are listed as priority populations for climate action because of their vulnerability to climate change impacts, limited resources or capacity to respond and adapt, or because of the intersections between these vulnerabilities. Those descriptions in yellow are reflected to a certain degree by the Maine Social Vulnerability Index. Some factors that are listed, although really important in describing priority populations, might be more difficult to capture by a census-based data set. For example, small towns with limited staff capacity, really important. I don't need to explain that to anybody on this call, but it's very difficult to include as a census factor. And I also just I'll be talking more about this, but I want to note that I'll be discussing a recommendation for how the Social Vulnerability Index can reflect tribal nations in this, the Maine Social Vulnerability Index, as the census data does not align with tribal lands and does not use tribal government names in most cases. A second really important index a lot of you might be familiar with is the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, CJUST. And we wanted to compare the Maine Social Vulnerability Index with the CJUST because CJUST is used in many federal funding programs. And some of the differences are that CJUST is provided just at a track level. It includes 33 variables reflecting burdens in 8 categories. And while the SVI uses just census data, CJUST uses a range of data sources that are difficult to reaggregate at a census county subdivision level. Many of the socio-demographic factors in CJUST, specifically that particular burden, are included in SVI, and those include households in poverty, unemployment status, housing cost burden, educational attainment, and English language proficiency. So just so you can kind of see, and I have some additional information if that's of interest or anybody wants to dig into that a little bit more. So that's a little bit about what the SVI looks like right now based on the categories, what the comparison is. Next, I want to dig into some of the limitations that we identified in this process, because it's a really important thing when we do this data. All data has some level of limitations. So first is any data set has some level of error. And in the census data, this is captured in what we would call the margin, what we call the margin of error. It shows the range of possible values. And as we drop calculations down from a census tract to a county subdivision to a lower population level, we may see larger margin of errors for lower population levels. For example, I've given this case of Webster that has reported population of 83, but the margin of error, the amount that can range is 72. Another challenge that we recognize is that not all municipal boundaries or town boundaries are captured really cleanly by the county subdivision. One other really important change from earlier census, the 2016, for example, is the use of the differential privacy policy. In 2020, the US Census implemented a differential privacy policy, which is essentially a scientific framework for protecting identities and personal information. The differential privacy policy essentially adds statistical noise, small random additions or subtractions to every published statistic. So no specific person or household can be identified with any certainty if you were to combine a number of the different data sets. What it means is that there is going to be some level of uncertainty in the data that's hard for us to actually see. And that is for the purpose to protect individuals, the privacy of individuals, what's important. But because of this shift, we might be seeing some interesting changes between 2016 and 2020 that would be explained by that. So very related to this, we have a large number of unorganized communities that fall within the LUPC jurisdiction. And many of these communities, have very low population, which presents challenges from when comparing them to organized towns for both of the reasons I just discussed. And I've already mentioned, but I really want to emphasize that another limitation is that census data in the format of county subdivisions does not follow the boundaries or reference names of federally recognized tribes. And I just want to mention for a lot of these reasons, so we just want to be aware of when we're comparing 2016 to 2020 data that we have to take into account a lot of these questions about data and accuracy. So what we've done is the very first thing we did is approaching updating this is we've made several recommendations, starting with meeting with staff at the Maine CDC, because they work with data sets that have a high level of confidentiality, and also dealing with low population levels, just to find out from them best practices. We met with staff at the LUPC to talk about the limitations inherent in the census data in rural states with small population. And one of the recommendations that came out is to consider treating the Land Use Planning Commission areas separately and not comparing an unorganized community to an organized town in this iteration. To address the concerns about low population and the differential privacy policy, we followed best practices of the Office of the State Economist and removed communities with low population, less than 60, communities that have very high margin of error to the value. And we did a calculation to sort of identify those communities that we would say low validity. And many of these fell within the LUPC because they're low population values. But there's some additional ones that we have identified as sort of being held out separately, so they're not included in the overall index. And then one other thing we really want to do is just to address the limitations that I mentioned before regarding tribal governments, is to discuss with tribal governments how to best represent tribal nations in this social vulnerability index. So one of the things that Jeremy and Liz and I and Brian and others who have been really listening to how communities are using this is I just want to sort of emphasize that this is a way to provide data to communities. It's a starting point. It's really intended, as Jeremy said, as a starting point for discussion. All of these categories matter. And we want to be mindful that in a community, you may have fewer number of these categories that are higher percentile, but those populations still really matter. And we may have communities that have a larger number of categories that fall within the higher percentile because of the percentages. And that really matters too. So it's a matter of just the number of sort of factors we're kind of taking and needing to pay attention to. And I show this slide here, which is I pulled out some of the individual factors and what their percentiles are, not to get too far into the weeds, but just to recognize there's some spatial distribution depending on what the factor is. We might see, for example, a higher percentage of population employed in the natural resource sector along the coast. We may see some other distributions. And when we kind of pull those all together, the intent is not to lose that, but to just sort of recognize there are some communities that will need to kind of look across many categories. And to help with this process of just digging in, we want to have a standalone web tool that's forthcoming, as Jeremy mentioned, that will host the full data set and associated measures for planning processes. So the next slide I want to show is right now the current draft of the Maine Social Vulnerability Index with all these factors. And I'll kind of walk you through what this is. So the darker gray are those LUPC areas that for now we've just pulled out with the hope of sort of developing an index that's specific to those areas. Those in lighter gray are those where we're sort of treating slightly differently for some of the validity and questions that we have, low population. We have identified those county subdivisions by name, Penobscot Nation and Passamaquoddy Tribe, Passamaquoddy Tribe. And then the remaining county subdivisions that we see in orange are the ones that we've done sort of the full calculation at this point, the draft calculation. And what we see are those range from darker orange, which are labeled as high. And essentially what that means is that those are communities with a greater number of categories that fall within the higher percentile. So, and then those in lighter orange have a fewer number of those categories that are the upper range of the percentiles. That's very tiny rating on this, the map itself, but I just want to make sure we sort of understand what those differences are. So as we look at this, have the first glimpse of this draft here, one of the things that we did is we went back and we looked at some things that we, were sort of maybe surprising findings based on the changes and the recommended changes. We really want to think about the implications. So in this next slide, what I want to show you is for communities that may have fallen in a different category in the earlier and now maybe low vulnerability sort of grouping because they had fewer categories within that, that had a high percentile. And then now we're in a slightly different category, high, because again, many of their categories might be the higher percentile. And I want to walk through to kind of explain why we think, we've seen these changes and what the implications are in terms of how we use this data. So one of the implications is the fact that we have included group quarters. And this may, and if we think of this as sort of assisted living centers as one example, it may not be surprising that we could potentially find these in larger communities, perhaps with greater capacity. But it's really important that we do think about what the meaning of that is in terms of, are we prepared for responding to the specific vulnerabilities that individuals living in these facilities may be facing? That is going to be important to look at. The next sort of combination of data is looking at the comparison of the average income, or PCI, in 2016. As I mentioned, that we looked at those with a higher average income, maybe lower percentile. So The PCI, those low numbers are because they probably have an average higher income, so their overall percentile in comparison to the rest of the state may be lower. When we add in housing burden, that shifts, in part because maybe housing costs in these communities are really high. And so what that allows us to look at is those communities where residents are really struggling due to the cost of housing, and how do we kind of respond to that? So that is one factor that could, these two factors themselves would provide important information, might explain some shifts. The other thing is just comes back to the question of the low population. When you have very low population, any shift could be significant in terms of how it gets represented in the overall index. So if we use Blue Hill as an example, we may see, back in 2016, a representative of zero population. I suspect it was not zero, but again, we're talking about really low population here. I mean, relatively speaking to the entire country. But when we see even a shift, which I imagine there is an increase in Blue Hill in single parent households, it could represent sort of a bigger bump in terms of how Blue Hill then gets represented. Is that important we pay attention to? Absolutely, right? That is going to be an important category. Same with no vehicle. That was another one that we saw a shift in percentage from about 5% to about 13%. So when we see those shifts, that could also contribute a bit to why we might see some different categorizations. So just wanted to kind of explain that in the context of some communities. But what I want to turn next is that, so how might we use the Social Vulnerability Index? Many of you are maybe using it already. And just coming back to Jeremy and Brian's point, it's really intended as a high-level planning tool that informs community discussions around who might be experiencing heightened social vulnerability. And I wanted to give an example of a project that Jeremy and Liz and I worked on with collaborators at Maine Sea Grant called the Mid-Coast Southern Mid-Coast Maine Social Resilience Project. I have a little QR code because we have all the materials, all the information, the guides, the reports on here. And I just want to use it as an example how we might think about using this. First of all, we focused on Southern Mid-Coast region, Saginaw, Cumberland County. We convened listening sessions because we were curious how people were using the Social Vulnerability Index. And we were hearing some interesting things from individuals about, their concerns about social populations with heightened social vulnerability. Using the SVI as a first insight into these communities, we looked at where we were seeing certain groups of populations, certain categories that might be at higher percent. And then we did an inventory of all the community-based organizations that were in place meeting the needs of those populations. If we had a higher percentage of population over 65, how many community-based organizations were actually meeting the needs of those community members? If we had a high percentage of residents where English was not their first language, limited English proficiency, were there organizations that were there to help meet the needs? And that sort of allows us to kind of look at the vulnerabilities and the capacity, because the capacity is really what we kind of want to understand. Once we had done that, we invited the representatives of these organizations through a scenario exercise where we walked them through a storm event where there could be a scenario of flooding, extended power outages, loss of access. And we asked them, who do you know will be vulnerable? Because the most important thing is to really recognize local knowledge and what people know about their own communities, and ask them, what should we do? And I want to highlight that because there are three things that came out of this that I think are really important to how we might think about using this. First, I think not too surprisingly, what people indicated who knew these communities aligned pretty closely with what we saw in the Social Vulnerability Index. Households in poverty who might be experiencing food insecurity, concerns about individuals with limited English proficiency, people living alone. Secondly, by bringing people together, what we could do is realize, do we have a capacity gap here where we have an organization who is concerned about how we get information out to residents with limited English proficiency about storm events? We found that the organizations that were providing those translation services. So bringing those groups together, we could build capacity towards meeting the needs of these individuals who might be experiencing heightened social vulnerability. And then the third finding was the articulation of vulnerabilities that we can't capture in the census, but are really important to pay attention to. One in particular, as we talked about this, and again, I want to put this in context of 2020, two representative community-based organizations said, gosh, there's going to be people that may weather one storm and perhaps lose a freezer full of food. But if they experience back-to-back storms, what we actually see is a group of people we might call newly vulnerable, that they're not going to be able to get through storm after storm after storm. And we as community-based organizations may need to look at our own resilience plans. So an outcome is just, there are going to be vulnerabilities that we can't capture, but we are really, it's so important to have those community conversations. And, I don't need to tell this group that, it was a bit poignant because, that is what we saw in these last years. So having those community conversations are going to be really critical. And the starting point is like, where do we focus our attention first to look at the capacity? So next steps overall for what we want to do is we want to hear from you, your comments, your questions on this proposed SVI. We want to explore the development of a separate index for the LUPC. We've just started to take the briefest of looks at that. We do want to initiate discussions regarding with tribal governments regarding the Maine Social Vulnerability Index. And we're moving towards a standalone web tool that will host the full data set and associated measures for planning purposes. And then I will move to my contact information and Brian's contact information. We really want to hear from you, from those of you who may be using this. And if you think after this, like, oh, I have this question or a comment, please feel free to reach out to us. We're just asking if you could let us know by July 4th, because we want to kind of continue to move forward to get this data out to you as soon as we possibly can. So I'll leave that up for a little bit, but then I'll turn it back over to you, Brian, for question and answer.
Super. Thank you, Eileen and Jeremy. That was fantastic. So we have a bunch of time here for some questions and discussion. I'm going to ask people to indicate their questions in two ways. You can put your question right into the chat, and then I either may read it or I may call on you to read it. Or you can simply raise your hand with the raise hand tool, and I can call on you that way. Or if you can't figure out how to make any of that work, just jump up and down, turn your screen on, and catch our attention.
I have a question. Eileen and Jeremy, this is Kathleen Layden. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand. Couldn't find my hand to raise it. But anyway, is it my recollection correct that an early pilot, like way before this work expanded, this is really awesome, really good material. Was that in Saginaw where Phippsburg implemented that emergency chain, like of what to do in a storm, neighbors calling neighbors? Is that an example of the outcome where they realized that just for talking to each other after emergencies and road closures and stuff, that they needed something like that? Is that accurate?
I'm not sure I could point to our project in particular. I know there's a lot of great practitioners and community members working on how to meet the needs of residents. It's a great example of what we'd like to have for an outcome, but it does fall within the area that we had started that first process.
Thanks, guys. Great work.
Yeah.
Thanks, Kathleen. Gabe, go ahead.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Eileen. That was really great to hear all of that. Good to have the updates. I'm sure some communities will be really excited with. I'm curious if there were changes in the other direction. Were some communities that were high vulnerability seeing themselves less vulnerable under the new or under the changes?
Yes, without going to sort of name, it's a great question. There are some changes, the other way. And I would expect we would probably see some of the same factors playing out for what could explain that. But yeah, we do see some shifts. Does that help answer your question, Gabe?
Yeah, no, that's great. I was just curious about that. And then I'm curious too, is like, when will we see this new version being used? This is a question for Brian. When will we see this new version being used for the Community Resilience Partnership?
Yeah, thanks, Dave. Good question. So when we've got some more work to do with Eileen and Jeremy on this to button things up. And when we do start to incorporate that into a new grant round, for example, we'll run a separate webinar talking about how it intersects with the partnership. Great. Claire Emmerich has a question in the chat, just hoping to hear more about the standalone web tool. I don't know, Jeremy, if you have anything more at this point to say on that, or if we save that one for another day.
No, I can address it now. I mean, once we finalize this data set, there's a Nature Conservancy mapping portal that we're gonna post the data to. We'll develop what it's going to be is going to be a very simple interactive tool that'll show the community, and you can click on the community and then it'll show the measures for the individual communities. And so we've been hearing that feedback that would be something that would be useful to people. So we will be working on that. I'm not the person to create that because I'm not very tech savvy in that realm. So I have a colleague, Dan Coker, who will be working on that product, and it'll be posted on this site. I'm going to put it in the chat. The maps.tnc.org/Maine is where our main mapping portal is. And so you'll see there are a few web tools there, including the Coastal Risk Explorer that has the coastal data from 2016, coastal SVI data from 2016 in there. And then also, because there's been so much interest in the Social Vulnerability Index, we decided we were going to create this standalone tool. So it should be probably a few months after we finish the complete data set.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Claire. Lori Osher, go ahead.
Thank you. My question, I really thought that was interesting that you had towns that became more socially vulnerable, and I'm hoping you could put that slide up again and talk to us a little bit more about the shift that happened. And also, do you have a map that shows or a table that shows how many slipped versus how many gained in social vulnerability index over the time period?
Eileen, you're on mute.
While Eileen is getting off mute and looking for that slide, I want to remind people that the other shift from 2016 to 2020 is the differential privacy policy. And so it's really unclear how much that may have played into some of these changes from one vulnerability category to another, but it's not something to ignore.
Great. Eileen, do you want to unmute and say anything more about this slide? While Eileen is looking for the unmute button and anything else, I'll just add in here that it's tempting to look at the map and say that communities X, Y, and Z went from medium to high vulnerability, and therefore some factor or there was something that changed their vulnerability to increase it, or vice versa. They went from a high to a medium or a low, and on the ground, there may not have been a change in vulnerability, but the way that the data is calculating in this index is what is getting reflected here. It's also possible that the communities have done something to change their vulnerability, improve it, or otherwise, and that would also be captured here in the data somehow, right? And so it's tough to draw conclusions one way or the other, whether it's a data artifact or if it's an actual change in vulnerability on the ground. But Eileen, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about so Laurie, is this a slide you were looking for? Yeah, and I just sort of like highlighting what Brian said is that, it's, there are some shifts, but I think we want to be cautious because I think part of it is that this recommendation that we follow the newest research, and I point to the average income and the housing burden is one where you might see some explanation of the shifts. So a relatively wealthier community might be really experiencing high challenges of those residents who can't afford housing in that, and we need to pay attention to that. So, I think we want to be aware of that, but I think what we also want to do is say, is this a good way forward for us to really provide, to get at the data we need to best understand these communities? And I think eventually, I think we could look at where those shifts have happened, and maybe that will be, we could provide that forthcoming in the later webinar. But Lori, did you have a specific question on this slide that you wanted me to talk to?
Well, you just, the columns, so could you describe again what group quarters is and PCI 2016 and housing?
Yes.
Just describe what those variables are and how they
So
fit into your model.
So group quarters, reflecting something like an assisted living center, and if you have a higher percentage of those relative to next door town, your percentile where you are related to that other town is higher. So a 0.8 means that there may be higher compared to other towns. The PCI, the average income, the higher the average income for a community, what the US Census SVI recommendation was in 2016 is that you essentially flip that. Higher income was a lower percentile. So if you were in the, a percentile much higher than other community, you would end up as a lower percentile. And if you had really low average income, you'd be the higher percentile in relationship, if you think on a scale of 0 to 1. What we do is we look at these all together in the final index, which is a scale from 0 to 1. So when we change the average income to housing burden, what we're doing is we're looking at related to the cost of housing. If it's much higher in a community than other neighboring communities, that percentage gets reflected you're in the 90th percentile in terms of what that represents. And all of that kind of pulls together in the social vulnerability index itself. Is that helpful, Lori?
So so Brewer, you're saying that Brewer's housing is very much more expensive than the neighboring towns?
When we look at all communities, right? If we
Okay.
look at all of them, yeah.
And what's the asterisk mean on Brewer?
I apologize, I deleted that and I'd have to go back and look at what that means specifically. I'm sorry, that might just be a typo on there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. That's clear. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lori. Alan, I noticed you had your hand up, but it's no longer up. Was there a question in there?
My questions were asked and answered, so thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Alan. Ashley, go ahead.
Yeah, hi. Thanks everyone for this really insightful talk. I think it's great to see that we're thinking about how to quantify social vulnerability. I think my question is sort of on the community side of it. How do we communicate this data and information with communities in a way that doesn't maybe feel like we're putting them in a box or saying, your social vulnerability is this amount, and it's sort of out of context. I know some of the towns I was working with as a CRP service provider, we had brought up this metric with a climate committee, and they were like, well, what does that mean? And no, or the town is really strong. And so I think if you have any recommendations on how to translate that data or approaches to this subject that could be more fruitful than just the numbers, would love to hear how we apply that learning. Yeah, thanks.
I'll jump in maybe, and Eileen, if you want to also. I mean, you really touched on something that we have agonized over for 7 years in this process, and I would say that one of the ways is that how you talk about it, and so that's why when I gave the intro and we talked about that these are systemic things, they're not inherent vulnerabilities in people or in communities, and so the vulnerabilities are a result of systems, and systems that don't necessarily have to be in place, if that makes sense. And so that was one of the main things that we have tried to, and maybe I gave it a little bit of short shrift today, but that's one of the ways. And I don't know if there's really a perfect way to do it. I feel like it's important to identify, underserved communities. And at the same time, I think that there's probably a sensitivity to how to go about doing that, which is, the nature of your question. And so, but that's one thing that we've done. Eileen, I don't know, or Liz, if either of you have something that you'd like to add to that.
I'd
Yeah,
also add
oh.
that just because, oh, sorry, Eileen, go ahead. All right, that the numbers are the result of the way people answer their census form. It doesn't reflect any kind of capacity or support or programs or policies that a community has in place to address some of those issues. And that's why you can't just take the number from the index and assume you understand the community. That's why having the community conversation about what the index is showing is just crucial, because, let's say the typical one in Maine would be over 65, or the typical two, over 65 and over 65 and living alone, what could easily make a community highly vulnerable. However, the community might have social systems in place to actually support those populations. And so the census data is showing that it might be vulnerable in that respect, but on the ground, they may have it covered and be doing a great job. So I think your question is insightful and just reinforces the fact that you can't use the number by itself. You have to have the community conversation.
Thank you, Liz, and thank you, Ashley.
Can I add
Questions
one
are coming
here? One thing I wanted to highlight is something that Jen Boothroyd put in the chat, which is to remain aware of the inherent weaknesses in the American Community Survey itself, which is such a good point. And we agree wholeheartedly that, all these numbers are based on statistics. So it's like statistic sampling that creates these numbers. So none of the numbers are perfect. No social vulnerability index, this one or the CGS tool, are perfect. There just is not a perfect way to measure this. And I think, but that point about the weaknesses of the ACS is really, really important to touch on. Sorry, Brian, to cut you off.
No, thanks, Jeremy. That was great. Yeah, that just echoes what I said at the open, that this is one of many tools that we have to use in coordination, right? So a number of questions in the chat about data and margin of error, weaknesses in the American Community Survey. These are great questions, and I'm going to see if Eileen or Jeremy or Liz want to hop in and take kind of a bigger picture approach to answering maybe three of these questions together.
And so I saw Chris's comment. That's a great idea in terms of like, could we build something in? One approach, not ideal, is that when we provide the data, we provide the margin of error, both for the numbers and the percentages, so that we all know what we're starting at. If you imagine there's already a margin of error for a whole population, when you start to look at a smaller and smaller group, that's important. And so I felt that that's really important to explain it and be upfront about the limitations. But it is data. It is the data we have, and so at least it can be informative as long as we are aware of that. But I'd be happy to kind of take a look and maybe follow up with you, Chris, with that idea. And then I don't know if Liz or Jeremy, if you have other thoughts beyond just, we can provide the margin of error data with this if that is helpful to use. I think particularly for those groups that are working with multiple towns and they can help interpret that. Liz and Jeremy, any thoughts, additional thoughts?
All right. Janet's question is about how the SVI categories in Maine might differ from federal categories.
So one of the things, and it's a great question, because one of the documents that we've been working on and had available with the earlier SVI is not only description drawing on the starting with the SVI variables from the federal CDC, US CDC, but also a summary of some of the literature. Because one of the things we do is we pay attention to the literature, like what's coming out. As I said, tracking is this index still used a lot. As a researcher, that's one of the things that I do spend some time on and then provide that information. And so we have some information with those definitions and why we've selected them, why we feel that it's important to pay attention based on the research on the impacts of climate change. And I suspect, just even it's anecdotally among this group, we could all probably speak to the impacts of the natural resource employment in that sector, but it's nice to have the science. So one of the things I'm hoping we can provide is more detailed information, a description, a list of resources. So if you want to go in and say, why is that in there? Why is that important? You can look at the same research we've been referencing. Hopefully that helps answer your question on that, Janet.
Great, Ashley, thank you. Good question about how this gets used moving forward. And I think that one of the reasons we thought it was important to do this update is that we are seeing more users of the SVI for various purposes. And so it was important to update the data, and then also important to start doing this kind of outreach so that folks had an understanding of what the data can be helpful with, where it needs to be augmented with other information, and where it has limitations and maybe have some applications that might not be appropriate. So we will do, specifically for the Community Resilience Partnership, we'll do another webinar where we talk about how this information plays a role in the Community Resilience Partnership. Folks who are familiar with that program know that we use it in a number of different ways to bring equity into that program. One of which being to encourage service providers to go out and find communities that might have higher levels of social vulnerability and assist them with getting enrolled in the program and applying for grants. So a number of different ways it gets used, and we'll talk more about that in another session.
Ryan,
yeah.
I just wanted to give a little bit more of a meta answer to Ashley's great question, which is that we wanted to be open with you about what the shortcomings are, and also to note that if we didn't think it was useful, we wouldn't do it, and so there is still value in it, and it's just that you can't take it as the end all be all and look at the number and say, oh, X community has a 0.91 index, and then feel like you know everything about the community. It's a great starting point. And so just to say, I know you weren't suggesting that it wasn't useful, but I just did want to note that we've had discussions all along the way about how useful would this be if we were to develop it. And so I do think there's value in it. It's just you can't use it as the only tool for assessment.
Thanks, Jeremy. Michael, go ahead.
Thanks. First, I want to say I greatly appreciate the conversation about the nuances of usefulness of this data, and I'm equally appreciative of the updates and the desire to take the federal Social Vulnerability Index data and make it more applicable to Maine and paint a better picture, particularly that factor around what rural states encounter. So much of the resources, such a large share of resources that come to the state are predicated on assumptions, particularly around urban centers, but often just simply more populated states with different features than ours. So kudos to you guys for diving in a little deeper and painting a more real picture. At the same time, this is less a question than an observation. The use of the Social Vulnerability Index as a guideline by the federal government for targeting funding is problematic to begin with, but made worse by the fact that Maine isn't as well represented in that data compared to many other places based on a variety of factors. And as this data is used within the state for example, targeting community resilience funding, I just, continue to have concern as an agency that is a funder, that works with a federal agency that gives weight to a data set that doesn't address things like challenges to foster youth, or doesn't incorporate factors that adequately reflect opioid misuse or concentrations of older veterans who are disconnected from VA services, which is often where funding is needed and where populations that have specific characteristics that make them especially vulnerable, makes it harder to get funding to support those organizations that serve those populations. And so, yeah, I am really encouraged that this data set is improving over time, but just want to raise my hand as somebody who struggles frequently with applications that come in that are trying to use a data set that is a mismatch, and encourage all of us in government to continue to recognize that there are lots of needs that aren't well represented, but are certainly socially vulnerable. So just wanted to throw my voice out there for that.
Absolutely, Michael. Thank you for that. Super important to remember that we can't capture everything. We can't tell every single story. And so it's incumbent upon us to go deeper than the data, right? Going back to the chat, Alan had a question. Looks like Liz answered it about other projects in the pipeline.
Now, I'll mention one other one too,
Yep.
that, and even just the opportunity to kind of look more closely. So there's another, I'm working with Liz and others, Gabe actually on Lincoln County, an application in that area, but I'm also working on a project with Sean Burkle and some other state climatologists with Vermont and New Hampshire to look at the vulnerabilities of manufactured housing communities, specifically to really understand that. That work is ongoing, and I imagine we'll have a white paper out about that to be informative for communities who may find higher percentage of their residents living in manufactured housing communities. So, and I think there's probably several other just among this group that are doing really important work that would be great to kind of highlight how you're finding it useful as a tool.
Thanks, Colleen. Let's see. Kathleen, yes, thank you for the suggestion about more outreach to communities about this, about the update and how they might be affected with that. We'll certainly be doing some of that through the partnership when we start talking about grant programs, and maybe there's a possibility to do some more. Let's see, who else? Let's see, Ainsley. Thank you, Ainsley. Great. Any other questions for our presenters today? We're getting very close to the end of the hour. All right. Well, thank you all very much for joining us for lunchtime today. Thank you, Eileen, Jeremy, and Liz for your great work and for the presentation today. As Eileen shared, we're really interested in your feedback and in short order too, since we're trying to keep this project moving along and getting to a more finalized product. So you can send comments or questions to me and or Eileen. Our emails were on the slides. And we'd love to hear from you. Thank you all so much. And we'll see you again soon. Have a great weekend.